All right, so we're going to keep talking about texturing today and things to think about and know with texturing and get used to. Some things we're going to be talking about in broader concepts and generalizing, but I want to bring them up as things to focus or pay attention to, especially if you like texturing, that there's something to delve into and engage with. But I also want to go over a textured pickle and some of the things that I chose to do. Now, what I chose to do isn't necessarily the only way to do it or the perfect way to do it. It's just the way I chose to do it at that moment. And actually, I have a separate file that I'll pull up who had me unwrapping it in a slightly different manner when I was going about things with a slightly different need. I'd also like to say that this is not an app pickle who I spent a lot of time working on the textures on. There's definitely errors running around and issues with it. But it's just sort of a general first pass to show you what you can do with texturing. And as far as the body itself is concerned, there's nothing I did with the body that you guys aren't capable of doing based on the lectures from the previous week. The stem and the leaves have a bit more detail, a bit more painted detail on them. It's still things that you would be entirely capable of doing, but they do get a little bit artistic, especially on a few pieces of the stem. But the base core body is entirely done with tools that we've gone over. But before we get into looking at how I chose to paint the textures, let's take a look at what is the first step for texturing, which is our UV unwrap. So here is our body, all unwrapped, all put together, and we can see the choices that I've made from unwrapping. So let's go through the same thought process that I would have used looking at this, and it's the same thought process that I went through in the last video with the other model. When I'm looking at a model that I'm going to texture, I need to look at it and observe it and decide, how am I going to need to take this apart? So the very first thing I want to think about is, what of those default unwrapping tools am I going to want to embrace? Am I going to want to use one of the shape unwraps, or am I going to want to use the automatic unwrap? And there's both personal preference engaged in that, but also what the object demands. Now, the pickle is basically a sphere. If we ignore the leaves and the stems, which were kept separate on this model so that they could be used for extra credit and such not, that pickle is just a sphere. That's all it is at its heart. It's a sphere with bits, but it's a sphere. So my very first choice was knowing that I was going to unwrap it with the spherical unwrap because it's a sphere. Now, going through and applying that spherical unwrap, I would have played around some with how it was engaged, how it was wrapped. I would have made sure that the front seam was lined up with the front of the pickle. I would have played with the handles on the side, and I would have tried to decrease the amount of distortion that this figure had innately from that very first step. So go through, apply the spherical UV unwrap. You know what? Let me actually go ahead and open it up and show you that part of the process real quickly. Okay, so this is the basic pickle file. Now, there is the fact that the pickle is facing the wrong way, so the front is not facing the front, it's facing the side. This was a purposeful error left in. So if I were to go and do a spherical unwrap, we can see that the front of this sphere, we can always tell the front by that blue circle, is facing the front, so it's facing the side. I would have had one or two options here. I could have rotated the pickle from the start, or I can take that spherical unwrap and move it appropriately so that we're facing here from the side and moved things around. The shift of it entirely is up to you and which way you want to go through and process it. But again, we can also just choose to rotate the pickle by -90 and have it face the front. This is why setting up your model from the first part is useful, because now if I do a spherical unwrap, if I go to object mode and do a spherical unwrap is actually facing the front. But we could also grab this middle and move it. But I would want to be looking at my UV map. I'd want to be seeing how it's sitting, how it's floating, and I'm going to be wanting to doing two things at this point. I'm going to be wanting to sort of drag these bounding boxes to look at the distortion, but I'm also going to be wanting to think about this object and where it sits and where I want to make sure my seam is. And if I leave this straight on the front, the seam's going to be all the way through the back, which is a way that you could definitely leave the seam. It's going to mean that you have more effort to make a clean seam if you're going to be texturing this fully for real along the back, and that can cause some issues down the line, but it's definitely something that you can leave there. But we could also go through with our spherical unwrap, and we can shift that spherical unwrap so that it's a little bit more facing the top of the model. And if we do that by dragging that middle, we can see that our seam decreases down, decreases down, decreases down, and now it runs more along the bottom of the figure. It does, unfortunately, start running along the front if we do that. And all of this, again, can be edited or manipulated or changed, but the more we think about how we want to set up this object from the beginning, the less cutting and pasting we have to do later. So I'm going to say that this is an epiggle that is going to just generally be maybe a moving critter in a video game. And we're going to be seeing it from the front and the side and potentially the back some, where we probably won't be seeing it as from the bottom. So I can definitely let the seam run around the bottom, because that's not going to be a place that it's going to be heavily seen. But I probably want to try to hide how obvious the seam is from the top. So a little bit of shifting and manipulation can really start to refine the way this piece moves and this piece looks. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect here, but if I spend a little bit of time playing with this shape here, I have less work to do later. And if I find out in the first 5 minutes of doing the work later that I don't like where this ended up, I can just change it. I can rerun this process and do something else. But let's say I'm happy with that. My next thing to do is to go and clean up the seam everywhere I don't want it and put it in places that I do want it. And we can see, because I moved that around, this line zigzags really horribly. It's not actually centered in the least. I have a whole row of edges over here that my seam line should really be one over, really should be running along this line. And I've got some things to fix. So I have a few ways that I can go about doing that. I have various cut and pastes that I can do. But my personal preference is to fix the things that are obvious loops arounds or things that I don't like. I like to go in there and sew those together. And anywhere where I really don't want the line to be, I want to go in and sew those points together so that they're not a consideration anymore. I want those all gone. So I'm going to go in and stitch up this ugly seam across the nose. I'm going to stitch up that loop around on the back. So I've got that all solved. And I'm going to go and clean up this center line. I prefer to tend to work in edges, but I could be doing this in face mode also and selecting all of these faces that are in the wrong place. But I have the personal tendency just to like to work over here in edge mode, because I find it really easy to think in that way when I'm working on texturing. So I can go through and select anything that I want to be the actual cut. So this whole center line that I want to be the cut, and I can go through and cut that. That does leave me with issues I need to fix. So again, I could go through and I can select those and sew them. Another option that I could go through and do, if we look at our UV shells, is I could work to cut off this whole shell over here on this edge and move this over physically in this space. We can basically see where it's going to puzzle fit in there when I'm done. Oh, I think get quite all of those fixed. We can see where that's going to puzzle fix in where that's done. But my next step is to do some cleanup. And it's highly recommended as you go forward and you clean up to go and select those UV shells and run some unfolds, because you'll really clearly see where things are doing what you're not wanting them to do. So we can see that very obviously we have this dangly bit here that we don't want. We can see that split in the nose. So I can go through and sew that split in the nose up. I can go through back into edge mode and I can say, well, that obviously isn't supposed to be there. So I can go through and cut on that edge and get that edge all sewn up there. I can see where it's supposed to be and sit. So I can go back and select UV shell, and I can rotate that, and I can move it into place of where it needs to stitch itself back together. Double checking that I'm stitching along the correct place. And such not. And I'm going to go and fix all of these little errors within this piece. So anything that's obviously not in the right place, who's not sitting well together, I want to go in and fix. And be it the fact that I'm going to go in and fix it here in this view, or I'm going to go in back to my model itself and fix it in the model view. Whichever one I find, whatever I find appropriate between those, I can do that. I tend to hop around between both of these, depending on what's easiest to get moved together and what's easiest to select at that specific time. So sometimes I may be sewing inside of the space itself, and other times I may be selecting things that I want to sew together in this view because I find it easier. It really is just a back and forth, but your next step is to go through and fix anything that you feel like you don't want, that you feel like is out of place. So, fix the thing, back to the Q tool, select it, UV unfold, start getting the shape that you want. And I'm not really caring at this point about refining exactly where I want the cuts to be. If I decide this is too high up the back later, I'm just going to go and fix it later. I want to get those big places that are obviously not there, that obviously don't belong, out of the way and dealt with so that they're not an issue anymore. Once I'm relatively happy, I'm probably also going to hit that optimization tool, tool, and let that apply also. So I'm going to get that first part of the overall cutting down. And then I'm going to go through and do the process of cutting out anything that I know is going to be a separate part. So where I'm going to go through and cut around the eye, for example, I'm going to go through and do that process and get that done. If I was going to cut out the nose here, this is when I'm going to go and do the nose process and cut out the nose. So I'm going to go through and create those cuts of those things that I want to be separate and just sort of, UV shell, and just sort of mass move them off to the side, because if things are going to be separate, I don't need them influencing what I'm going to go through and cut. So anything that's going to sit as a separate piece, and there's some choices to be made about where exactly those split and those color splits and things like that are going to be done. But I'm going to go through and make those choices here so that I can see what I want to have happen. Oh, there's a little bit of a wonkiness in the model right there. Don't worry, I won't expect you to have fixed that. I'm just going to actually choose to go out one edge loop higher to not deal with that right now. So I'm going to go through and cut out all of those various things that I need to cut out. And these, again, are these things that I know I'm going to color separately. I gave you a list of what you needed to think about coloring separately to see that you can go in and cut those things out separately. On Blackboard, But going through and dealing with those properties and making those changes is a really nice thing to do at this stage. So you know everything's sitting happy within that process. Okay, I think I said to cut out the eyes, the coloration around the eyes, or paint it in differently, but we're just going to end here because I want to keep moving on with this explanation. Again, I'm very often going to go and unfold these shapes to make them look as good as possible. Now that I've got all the pieces cut out, we're pretending I've got all the pieces cut out, my next goal is to think about the distortion. Where am I having big issues of distortion? And one of the areas I'm having big issues of distortion are these concentric circles down here that are the feet. And remember, if I don't know what something is, the best thing to do is just go select part of it in the model itself and see what gets selected in the UV. Well, I have the feet here, but they're really distorted ovals versus these relatively basic circles. We get a lot of stretching in these pieces. They're pretty much squares underneath here, but we have these really big stretched out rectangles now. That means I have an issue underneath this. And this is where going in, like I talked about in the last video, and cutting it apart like you were skinning an animal, which I know, again, can get a little bit on the morbid side, but there's a reason it's called skinning and pelting. I can go through and select those pieces. So run up the belly, up each leg, go through and cut those. Oh, I got a piece selected that I didn't mean to get selected there earlier because I'm not being careful with this process. That's okay. All of this we can cut and fix as need be. I'm going to go sew that back together. But if I cut up the belly like that, and now I unfold it, notice how much better that unfolds. And again, this still looks weird and wonky and a little bit unusual, but what I'm looking for is distortions. And now these pieces underneath that are basically squares are basically squares here. I've helped alleviate some of that distortion by where I've chosen to go in and cut things around. There's still distortion sitting here in the foot, and I could decide to solve that in a few ways. If I felt that the bottom of the feet was an issue, I could go around and cut a little bit along the bottom of the feet like that. And if I cut along the bottom of the feet and unfold, we can see that we spread out a little bit more. We get a little bit less distortion right there in the foot. But I'm trying to look at the overall shapes and make sure the overall shapes of these faces are at least similar enough to the overall shapes of the figure itself. So my last step is to going in and fitting those distortions in and trying to make the least amount of distortions in here. I'm actually okay with my squares getting narrower as I go up top because they really do get narrower as I go up top. If I feel like my shapes are a little bit off and a little bit squashed in one way, I can even squash and stretch it with my scale tool inside of the figure itself here. Move, rotate, scale, it all works in this space. But I would go through and continue to work on that and refine this. Going back to the other ones that I've already finished here, we can see here on this one then, that's basically the process I went through here. Going through and wrapping around, cutting all the way up the middle. I ended this pretty much underneath the belly, which does mean that I ended up with a decently messy area of distortion underneath the nose, but for whatever reason I decided to leave that or not really care about that, in part because I might have said, well, that's just going to be a solid color. I'm not going to be really painting anything there, so I don't have to worry about the issue. I'm more focused on the back and the things like that. That might be the process. I left the interior nose pieces part of the nose here because I just colored them separate through selection tools in Photoshop. I could have easily pulled those out like in the past example and easily colored them their own colors. Probably would have been quicker to do that, but it's not a process I did here. So you can see even myself, there's variations between what I've chosen to do and how I chose to do it. This is an example of one where I cut off each of the tips of the feet so that they could be hoofs or something like that. In this one, I did cut out the nose interiors separately. I did run it up underneath the snout entirely, so I have a really full unfold here. I did not run up the legs in this case, in part because cutting out the feet helped the level of distortion there. So again, there's another way of cutting this apart or unfolding it. There's shifts between all of these, just depending on my process, my personal preference, my practices, my training, and you develop a little bit of your own style and process therein. But even if you unwrap the same thing in the same different times from each other, a year apart or whatever, you may be doing things slightly different. And it doesn't matter as long as you get something that's workable. So back to this app Pico because it's the most complete of my options. So I went through, I got my UV happy, I saved out my UV snapshot, so I had it to work with, and I dumped it in Photoshop because that's the program I was working in, and I painted my various textures in there. And you can see that I've obviously got a color on all of these, but you can also see that I have a displacement map on all of these. The app Pickle has some bumbles and things and some very specific indents, some of which match what's going on with the color. If you ever want a displacement map seem more robust without it being deep, combine what's happening with the displacement map with what's happening with colors. And I have the same thing going on the ears and the stem. The stem gets a little bit more detailed with that separate top and things. Oh, you know what? For the heck of it, before we move on. For the leaves, I pretty much split them in two halves because I knew I could paint a front and the back. And if there was a little bit of a seam running along the edges, it's the edge of a leaf. I felt that was acceptable. And then for the stem, I cut out the top because I knew I was going to texture the top as if it's an exposed stem there. And then I have the whole sides. So that's how those UVs ended up looking. So I put this into Photoshop. I painted it red. I added a little bit of noise so that it wasn't just a flat color. And then I went in with a big old chunky brush and I painted in a little bit of color difference up here at the top. And I went in with a really splattery brush and I painted in some spots. And so the colors that I ended up with look like this. Oops. So we can see here I have that little bit of overall broken color. You can see a little bit of shading here. So I did a very, very subtle clouds. It may look less subtle on your computer than on mine, depending on your color balance. I just glanced over at my second monitor / TV, and it's definitely more obvious on there than my well-balanced monitor. But I did a subtle difference cloud, just between a red and a more orangey red. I have the little bit of color that I put here up top. A little bit of noise goes a long way. And then I've got some splatters in there. And I may have actually not done this with a splatter brush. I may have actually just gone in with a regular brush and just been dot, 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 dot in some different sizes. The nose is just all matte black. Excuse me, the eyes are just matte black. The nose, I basically left one color. Again, probably would have been easier if I had separated the nostrils manually, but I just painted them in here with a little bit of a soft coloring. So they have a little bit of a difference. Some of this basically became my bump map. I pretty much would have painted these dots on their own layer so that I then could copy that layer and use that layer as my displacement map and put in the dots as a darker gray. Remember, if it's darker than the 50% gray, it's going to sink in. If it's lighter, it's going to rise out. I have a little bit of broken noise, which again, you may not be able to see, especially with YouTube compression. That raises it up, but that made sure that the dots corresponds with the dots I had in the color. So where I have all of these dots, just by copying and recoloring that layer, I ended up with these darker dots. And so my bump map lines up with my color and makes them both seem more intense. Same general gist with the leaves. I actually got really, really lazy painting the leaves. These are not pretty intersections at all. And I think I was even exceedingly lazy where I painted one side of the leaf and copied and pasted it to the other side and didn't really worry about perfectly lining it up because I was just moving quickly. I have a soft fade here. I painted in some 3D-ness craziness, which mimics on the bump map. Again, I basically just copied and pasted that and did some grayscale stuff to move that around. The leaves also do have a incandescent map that I put on for a little bit of shininess purposes. And it looks like I did a little bit of... I labeled this translucence, but I maybe actually had it in there in specular. Let's see what else I have here. Stem. Color for the stem. Bump map for the stem. You notice that the color is basically just putting in these stem streaks. Got the stem streaks in the bump map, but I also have this overall just noise texture that I just put in to add a little bit of noise and a little bit of that going on. And then it looks like I also do have a specular map for the Appigal so that the nose and the eyes look wetter than the rest of the Appigal. Specular maps, like we've talked about, work on black and white also. Black being not shiny, white being shiny. So I also put in one of these so that everything, for the most part, is a 50% gray, which means it's going to be the normal shininess of the texture. And then I painted on white for the eyes so that they're shinier than the rest, and this sort of mottled shininess for the nose to give it a little bit of a wet look. And if we spin this around, we can see a little bit of higher gloss running around on some of those. And that all gives me my render of my Appigal. So this is how the Appigal renders out. Again, it's not perfect, but it does its job. So that was my thought process of going through and working on the Appigal to get to this finished point without getting too fancy, without pulling out things that you guys don't know how to do. Again, I painted more on the stem or the leaves that those of you without an artistic knowledge wouldn't have gone through. But as far as the base Appigal itself, the body, it's the level of knowledge that you guys already have or should have if you've been practicing and watching along with the videos and such not like that. And that gets us this Appigal. What I do want to take the time and talk about now is some other material options and rendering options. And specifically, I want to take a moment to talk about Arnold. Arnold is a rendering software which comes with Maya by default. When you all installed Maya, you all had a choice of installing Arnold or not. If you were following along with the course outline, it told you to install Maya with Arnold specifically. And I want to take a moment to talk about Arnold. Arnold is going to be a software who's going to look more in depth at the realism of materials. And a lot of the realism of materials comes from that specular aspect, that shine and that surface. It can also pull into reflections and transparencies if you have materials who are dealing with reflections and transparencies. If you have Arnold installed, you will have the option to go to the Arnold renderer and render from your Arnold renderer. There's something that's going to happen though if you render under Arnold, which is it's going to pitch a fit and just be a black box by default because the Maya default lights do not render in Arnold. So there's a little bit that we need to do to make sure things come through and render in Arnold. I'm getting a little bit of the leaves here because of the specular color that I've got going on, but it's not actually wanting to render. I think I double-clicked the render button there, so now it's screaming at me. So if you're going to render in Arnold, you need to do lights, and we haven't talked about lights yet. That's another part of the semester. It's our third part of the semester, but I want to take a moment to talk about Arnold so that we can see that difference and the difference that it looks like. So I'm just going to reset this to Maya software here, and then we're going to go and talk about and show the difference with Arnold and a more complex rendering system and what it does. So here is my Appigal, again, rendered in Maya software with the default lighting. I'm going to go in and add in some lights. I already made them, I just deleted them. I'm going to go in and add some lights because Arnold needs to have the non-default lights rendered. There's only a specific set of lights that Arnold renderer will look like, but I need to add the lights so that there's something to reflect. And now if I go back in and render it again, it's going to complain for a moment here. I'm going to switch to the right camera. Now that those lights are in, you can see how blown out this is. Arnold rendering needs more intense lights than Maya's software because it's taking the renderer at taking lights at fall off and bounced light and a higher level of detail. But if I go in here and I now render this out with Arnold renderer, one thing that you'll see is it's taking a lot longer. Taking a lot longer to render because it has a lot more computations it's thinking of. But after this is rendered, you'll see a few things. You'll see that we have reflections that are happening on the apical that are sitting. We now see the reflections of the stem and the leaf. We see that we have some of that bouncing up, and some of the bounced colors of the red is bouncing up into the stem and the leaf. So we're seeing some reflected colors and things like that. But going through and looking at the two differences, you can see that there's a great deal more detail running around here in our Arnold renderer. We have a lot more nuance, things handled a lot more gently than we have in our regular apical. A downside of Arnold renderer is our default bump maps don't run and function. In our Arnold renderer, there's some crazy stuff that we have to do, but just by changing the way we render using Arnold renderer, we have a very drastically different look. The textures here are both exactly the same. It's just how those lights and how those textures are being computed and how they're being handled. So Arnold Render is a very powerful tool to start rendering things out and working with them. And if we jump over here into our Hypershade, we can see that Arnold Render also comes for us a number of default shaders that are looking at different surfaces. So like there is a car paint shader who allows you to have a flip-flop, so colors who shift between each other within there. And if there's a coat on it, so like a clear or semi-clear spray coat, how that affects the depth of our surfaces. There's a toon shader in here running around by default. We have flat, matte, etc. So there's a number of different shaders here sitting in our Arnold renderer, shaders who have some default ideas and concepts going on. But Arnold is a really powerful sort of rendering tool, even if we're just dealing with our default render networks. Like here's the body node network that I've got going on for this. So I'm pulling in my color, I'm pulling in the specular, I'm pulling in our bump. Again, just a general setup, but by going through and rendering it with a different render software, we get a drastically different look going on and a drastically different feel going on in that process. So using and embracing Arnold renderer can be a really nice thing to be able to do, especially once we start talking about lighting and getting into lighting, to make things more robust. If you're going to be doing Arnold renderer, it's good to think about it sooner rather than later, because there are some things that might need to be shifting and playing around with. But right now, you have the limitation that we haven't talked about lighting, so Arnold is going to be a little bit off that basis. But it is a very powerful tool to make some very interesting renderers out of it. Another rendering option is RenderMan. RenderMan is Pixar's in-house rendering program that is an incredibly robust piece of software. You can get a non-commercial license for free as a student. I'll drop this link into the Getting Started section of Blackboard. You do need to register for the forum. It walks you through how to do that. You can then download it for Maya, let it install in the default folder. Otherwise, you're going to have some issues running around. And then you can use it for Maya. In Maya, you may have to go to Window, Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager. Again, Window, Setting and Preferences, Plugin Manager. Find where it has RenderMan. Wherever it ran to. Somewhere in this list. Find where it has RenderMan. And once you find it, let's pretend it's right here, click the checkbox to make sure it loads. And go ahead and click in that auto load. So that's in there. RenderMan comes with a whole host of predefined textures and a whole host of textures that you can download from the forum and apply. RenderMan wants to use RenderMan's lighting, if it can at all. As soon as you install it, as soon as you install it, you're going to have a RenderMan tab. It wants to use its lightings and it wants to use its surfaces. You can either use some of its predefined surfaces in here, or you can create your own RenderMan surface, and you can go through and create your own RenderMan surface and go through and define all of the surface properties. You can use a default material as its base and define on top of that, or you can go through and define all of its properties therein. But you can also use its preset properties. You get to the presets by opening it up with this little blue sphere, and anyone you want, you can right click and say assign and apply. Please note, to get the full experience of this, you're going to want to put some environment around your object. RenderMan wants to use environments because it's all about bounced light and how light is moving around an environment, because again, it's that more sophisticated kind of rendering. But you can go and render it and take a look at what's happening and see the level of detail that you can get as you go through and render. And it's a relatively robust render because again, it's looking at that high level of realism. There's two forms of rendering. There's the full render or the real-time or attempted real-time render, which is what I'm in here. The real-time render is fuzzier by default. There's a whole bunch of settings and things that you can change within this, yada, yada, yada. But it's another rendering-based option that's really good as a student. If you're really interested in texturing, looking deeper into Arnold or looking deeper into RenderMan is an incredibly useful thing because of how robust they are. Again, this is the rendering software, or technically Pixar uses a slightly in-home version of RenderMan, but this is the rendering software developed and supported by Pixar. So it's that level of quality of rendering. And just as we go through, and if we apply different materials to this object, we can see the different renders that happen and the different looks and depth and things that we can get just by going through and applying these different materials. And again, you can make your own material too. Here's a soap bubble, for example. Look at that lovely, beautiful soap bubble. Again, things are going to take longer to render. Things will be slow to render depending on how many objects you have, how much light you have. I didn't go through and futz with the lighting in here. I just used the default Rembrandt light rig. Again, right-clicked, import it to apply. But you can go through and make some really robust things. Again, it wants scenes to bounce off of. The more surfaces you have, the happier and better this is going to be. This is the program that I rendered the ink and quill in. So this here is rendered in RenderMan. Some things are default material textures like the glass, and then other things are either slightly modified or they're completely custom made, built up as a regular texture and things like that, but this is rendered in RenderMan. There's more nuances to RenderMan to get used to that we're not going into because this higher level of focus is not our primary for this course. This course very much is let's get the basics of texturing, let's get the basics of lighting, let's get the basics of modeling down. But if you're enjoying texturing or you think you could enjoy texturing, really consider taking a look at Arnold and taking a look at this program. And if you want to, for the future projects, use RenderMan or use Arnold, especially Arnold, because since it's built into Maya, we can very easily transfer things over to Arnold just by selecting it from the drop down and making sure to use lights Arnold likes. You are welcome to use Arnold going. You are welcome to use like Arnold going forward. But I didn't want to let this second talk go without looking a little bit more into RenderMan, what I can go to, even if it's just basically telling you, hey, it's out here. If you're interested in it, consider looking at it. But it's just a little bit more of a walkthrough of the process and concepts behind working with things and texturing things. And some things I want you to keep in mind going forward.